Hello, welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and this is the show where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. And speaking of that, we're speaking today with State Auditor and candidate Doug Hoffer, who is probably has his thumbs in most of what state does and how it shakes out for the rest of us. So very appropriate that you're with us today, Doug. And I also want to welcome to the show regular contributor Emily Kornheiser, who is one of 3 reps from the town of Brattleboro. And for our audio listeners, I'm so sorry you don't get to see her absolutely wonderful color palette today of blues and greens and kind of like a peacock blue. It's very wonderful. So welcome to the show, Emily.
Thank you, Olga. Very nice to be here. And good to be here with you, Doug.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure when you join the show, Doug. So thank you for being here today. I'm going to start with a question that I've been asking everyone who is running this year. And you are running again for the position of state auditor.
Yes.
Good. Just suddenly my brain went blank and I thought, oh no, what if I'm wrong? It's been that kind of summer. But of all the ways you can serve your community, Doug, why have you chosen the path of elected representation?
Well, the work I did for over 20 years as a policy analyst was very rewarding and challenging, and I enjoyed it thoroughly. But I thought, perhaps foolishly, that I could add a little more value by getting into this job. And I think we have to some extent. It's very challenging to get beyond the issuance of reports, which are very strong. I am so grateful to be the front guy for all the staff in my office. They do a great job. But there's only so much we can do. And that's by design, I suppose, both by the Constitution and the legislature through the years in the statutes. I can't compel anyone to do anything. And that's probably a good thing. but when we make recommendations that are not primarily just administrative, which are very important for their own sake, but if they are related to policy or something that the legislature can revisit, if it's something they've done in the past, I can't make them do it. They can say, hey, thanks a lot, got to go. And they often do that for reasons, sometimes that make sense and sometimes don't. So that's frustrating, and I just have to live with that. What are you going to do? But I think we've made a difference, and I enjoy the work. I still enjoy the work. And you said I'm running. I feel like I'm a perpetual candidate. It's this whole 2-year thing, which I didn't care about before I ran for office.
Yeah, before you start running for office, it seemed like a good idea. You got lots of turnover, and now you're like, oh my gosh, it's just a lot of work.
Well, the campaigns for me, fortunately, are not a lot of work. I haven't had much real opposition over the years. I mean, there have been names opposite mine on the ballot, but most have not really actively campaigned, certainly without a lot of resources. So I've been spared much of what, candidates for other offices are required to do.
Now, I know we've had you on the show before, Doug, but for listeners who might be new to your office, could you give us the 30-second elevator pitch about just some of the, I know you go through and hold, you're part of the branch that holds government accountable, but your office puts out a bunch of different types of reports. Some are investigations, some are audits. Could you talk about kind of the different type of information you put out?
Sure, thank you. To be clear, we are not a branch. We are part of a branch, and we are the only part that tries to hold government accountable. There's only 16 of us, and there's 8,000 of them, so it's a challenge, and an $8 billion budget. But no, I'm happy to do that. I think there's some misconceptions about what we do. People think of green shades and auditors and dollars, and of course, that is a core part of our responsibility, which is to say audits of the state's financial statements, which Wall Street requires. Then there are compliance audits of all the federal money that comes in to fund the programs. We don't do either of those. They're very time consuming and technical. And to me, at least as a policy guy, kind of boring, but they need to be done. So we farm them out. And that's been the case for 25 or 30 years. what that leaves us free to do is performance auditing, which is looking at how state government is run as a business, which is part of it, sort of the nuts and bolts, and also programmatic performance audits, which I really enjoy. And I like them both. I have respect for the need for the nuts and bolts stuff, because that helps managers do their work a little better. So basically, we look at how state government operates, and that can take many forms, some superficial, some much deeper. We don't usually look at structural issues because those are political decisions, and we don't look at policy choices because they too are political decisions. So we look at how those policies are implemented and whether they're effective and whether they're cost effective as well.
You know, Doug, when you were talking about, I know that I talk to a lot of folks when I'm campaigning or just when I'm legislating, a lot of my constituents about government accountability. And what that means. And perhaps I talk to a lot of constituents about it because I'm very focused on it, not because they're very focused on it. I'm realizing as I'm speaking that I'm not in fact sure where the chicken and the egg are there. But when I have these conversations with folks, including the person who's running against you, who happens to be my constituent, so I've talked to him about these issues a lot. It seems like an issue that Vermonters care very deeply about, that things, you know, and it's sort of like very Vermont values, New England values, you know, like government working right and meeting folks' needs and doing it with sort of the, you know, right resources, minimal resources. And I'm surprised at how many people know about the federal GAO, Government Accountability Office. And so what I'm wondering is, you know, one of the things that I like about campaigning every 2 years is, and there are a lot of things I don't like about it. I don't want to pretend that I, you know, think that the 2-year cycle is what's best for Vermont government, but is the opportunity to go out and talk to folks about what's meaningful to them from the work I do and what they want from me. And so I'm curious, in your role, I know you have a very small office, what opportunities you all have to find out sort of what Vermonters want from you and to really share with Vermonters the work that you do.
I can speak to the latter much better than the former. I don't do a lot of outreach seeking input, although I hope it's clear to people that I'm accessible. Anybody that sends an email or makes a phone call to my office, we respond to promptly. And I kind of enjoyed that. And they're all over the map, as you would expect. The second is something I acknowledged a few years back. My second deputy, who is now a very high guy in the tax department and very, very capable and smart guy, he said that he thought we could do a better job in trying to reach more people, because the media, to be honest, as we discussed before we went on air, you know, is limited by resources, and for other reasons they make choices about what to cover that I have no control over. So I don't think my office and the work of my office was getting sufficient coverage. So what I did is take an email list of, at that originally, about 16,000 names that I bought from a guy for a campaign a couple of years back. And when I was done with it, I said, I'm never going to need this again for a campaign. So I contacted the Attorney General's office and asked if it was okay if I gifted it to my office for use for us. So that is now the basis of our newsletter distribution list. And some have backed out, which is fine. They've moved. They don't care. They don't like me, whatever. But we go to about 14,000 people. And I think you just got a newsletter the other day, Emily. And maybe if you're not on the list, I'll put you on the list, Olga. And you'd be surprised. You might be surprised at how many people the system records as having opened that document. The other day, it was over 7,000 people in less than 24 hours. The intent of that is to inform them without making it too complicated. It's basically a page or to 2 pages with a graphic or two. And I really feel good about that. And we get a lot of emails from people, mostly pleased that we're there, that we're paying attention, that we're covering stuff that they care about. I could do a better job, Emily, no doubt, about seeking input, but we can only do, 6 or 7 or maybe 8 reports a year.
Absolutely.
And that's one of the few critical decisions that I get to make, what to devote our resources to, when, and to what extent. So while I'm happy to hear input from my staff, from you and your colleagues, and from the general population, those are my decisions. That doesn't mean you can't call me.
No, oh, sorry, go ahead.
You go ahead, Olga.
Oh, I was just going to ask about, you've done some, when I went to your website, I saw 2 recent investigations. And one was on homelessness in Vermont, and one was on the, hopefully I get this right, VCJC, which is the Vermont Criminal Justice
Council. Yeah.
Council, thank you. And how they verify whether police officers have actually completed the training that they are expected to take. I would love to kind of dive into those two pieces, but before we do, Emily, was there something else you wanted to talk about before we did that?
I think it's actually, I have sort of a bigger theme that I've been thinking about a lot, which is around who does what when something isn't working. And sort of roles and responsibilities with regards to that, mostly because I feel frustrated with my limited ability to do something when something's not working. So I'm thinking about it a lot. And so I would love to just keep on circling back to that as we talk about various issues that your office has taken on.
Although I'm happy to talk about those two. I don't know how much time we have, but before we go, I would like just a couple of minutes to let people know what we're working on now.
Why don't we just start there?
All right. And this comes out of my staff meeting this morning, so it's right in front of my head. Fascinating job on long-term care in Vermont. Now, we know that because there's so much federal money in nursing homes, CMS does a good job of kind of looking over Vermont's shoulder. So there are a lot of regular inspections of those facilities, as there should be. But the other two types of facilities, which represent a lot of people, assisted care and residential care homes.
My mom is one of those people. Yep.
Yeah, there's an awful lot of them, and it's, as it turns out, that they don't get the kind of attention that the nursing homes do. So that report is moving along pretty well. We should have that before too long. That's a good one. We also decided, after a call from a rep from the Defender General's office who was talking to folks in, I think, Mississippi, where the other prison is, or a prison that we use to some extent, about grievances that weren't being addressed, and they were concerned. And I said, I can't devote our resources to an out-of-state prison for one or two people, but I am interested in looking at how the Department of Corrections deals with grievances in Vermont. So that's kind of an interesting job, and there might be some challenging findings and recommendations there. We have a job going that's not sexy at all, but you got to go where the money is sometimes. And we really haven't done much at the Agency of Transportation. So we're looking at their use of federal and state funds for paving projects and the extent to which they're on time, on budget, and so forth. And so far, it's looking pretty good, to their credit. We also, because of Emily's colleagues some years ago, are required to audit every TIF town in Vermont every 3 times during its life cycle. Don't you laugh, Emily. It's a tremendous amount of work, really a lot of work. And we are completing the audit of what is unquestionably the most complicated and convoluted one in the state, and that is the Burlington Waterfront TIF, which is really interesting. That's leading into the next one on the schedule, which is South Burlington, which is modest by comparison, and I think better organized, which will be good for the staff. We also have an interesting project that we haven't initially started yet. We are still in a planning or risk assessment phase on the extent to which towns in Vermont are challenged by large commercial and industrial property owners with regard to what their property tax should be. And this came out of a job we did a number of years ago about ski areas. And it was sort of a sidebar thing that we didn't anticipate, but they're very powerful, both statewide as an industry and in their towns, because they're huge compared to the small towns where most of them are located. So you can imagine, as regular residential property owners do, if their taxes go up, they say, hey, what the heck? Our evidence shows that it should be this, and you said it was this, and so forth. There's an appeal process, and there's a question about how much should the town spend to defend its position when the return might be this much, but there's a huge risk to the ed fund. So it's an interesting subject. So, and the tax department has already written a report about this. They didn't make any recommendations, but they expressed some concern. So that's a fun one.
Let's slow way down, because I have things I want to say and ask about each one of those. And you are moving. I've already forgotten what the first one is, and I have questions and thoughts.
Long-term care.
Long-term care.
Yes, I'm mostly kidding. I remember what the first one was. So this, I don't know if folks even know that the ed fund is sort of statewide, and that town taxes and all those things. So I just want to let's pause on that one for a moment and talk about what's exciting about it. So
I think that's very exciting.
So property valuations in Vermont happen at the local level, and then we sort of equalize them across towns and across the state so that inconsistencies from town to town sort of get ironed out. There's a lot more to it. That's what the common level of appraisal is, and we're not going to get into those details today. And then when you're charged property taxes, some of that money goes to the education fund, which is a statewide fund, and some of it goes to your town. The town is responsible for collecting both of those, though. What happens when a large property owner comes to not want to pay the taxes that they are asked to pay because they think it's too high, or they know that arguing will make it lower, regardless of what they think is true, the town only has so many resources and only certain attorneys available to them to make that case. And while they might not get that much back in their town property taxes, there's a lot of risk to the state because of that statewide ed fund, as you just said, Doug. And so tax put out a report without recommendations, but on that report, we started a process to actually have statewide funding and assistance in order to help towns make those arguments. But I think there are questions even beyond that, and I'm curious to read your report to see if it really is the problem that I imagine it to be. With our town appraisers even the appropriate folks to be making those appraisals on those larger properties? You know, there are only so many of them in the state. There's probably one in each town. There might only be a few in a county. And so maybe those should just be appraised at the state level and not appraised at the town level, to take both the burden off of the town and to make sure that someone who might have more experience dealing with such future lawsuits might take that on. And so that's, we started that process, I think last year in Ways and Means, and I'm excited to read your report to see what else it can give us for those details.
If we get there, I mean, we're in the risk assessment phase, and we'll find out, I think, within a few weeks whether we're going to proceed. But I appreciate your interest. I'm not surprised.
Great. And then the one before that, which one? What was that?
TIF.
TIF.
Oh, that's not. We're not going to talk about TIF today. TIF is like a whole day of talking.
It's about 20% of my staff resources too. I'm sad to say.
Yes.
Before that was AOT paving. I don't think that's a terrible interest.
Well, what's actually interesting to that about that is I am continually amazed at how much Vermonters care about paving. And I have colleagues who, like, on their annual legislative reports to their constituents, put the paving schedule at the bottom of those legislative reports because that is the #1 thing that their constituents ask them about. And I'm lucky enough to be one of 3 reps from Brattleboro, and I have Molly Burke, who serves on the transportation committee, as my colleague from Brattleboro. And so I defer and refer all transportation questions to her. And
well, of course, you know, the state is only responsible for a certain percentage of the roads.
Yes, but there are all kinds of like wild loopholes and wild passing of responsibilities between the town, the state, and the feds. And so I think that's actually going to be a pretty fun little report, even though I, would rather not touch it with a 10-foot pole myself.
Before that was corrections grievances.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting.
That's almost done. We're going to get the so-called message report probably tomorrow, and maybe a final draft in 2 weeks. So yeah, no, it's very interesting. And there's no strong constituency supporting the rights of people in prison. No, I'll be the first to acknowledge that. On the other hand, as the 8th Amendment makes clear, once they're in our charge, we're responsible for them. So it's not just whether we treat them well and give them health care and clothes and food and lodging, but if there are complaints, legitimate ones, and to be clear, prisoners have a lot of time on their hands. So it isn't surprising that there are many, many complaints. I'm not interested in the volume. I'm interested in how the department responds to those that are substantive and relate to the health and welfare of these people as human beings. So I'm interested for that reason. The other one, the first one.
Oh no! So on that one, you said that you're not going to look into the out-of-state prisons because it's sort of beyond your purview. But I think of you as
not beyond our purview. It's just we
beyond
only
your
have so many
capacity right now. Okay, because I think of your office as an office that's deeply focused on the state's contracting relationships, and the idea that we would outsource such a profound human responsibility is just like continues to bewilder me, actually.
I agree.
And the implications of that for families, for, you know, people seeking regress from the state, all of those things, it's quite a profound problem. And again, a very limited constituency of folks who are attentive to it. But the solving of it also becomes really complex. Yeah, and it's a lot of money.
And some would have you believe that it's cheaper to send prisoners out of state, when in fact, I did some work for BSEA 15 years ago before I got elected, and they were interested in this question. I looked into it, and as it turns out, it's not apples to apples. They don't send prisoners out of state who have significant needs. Vermont provides quite a bit in the way of services to people, mental health, and they keep the sicker folks here because, you know, if you're just going to send them to a warehouse in Mississippi, they're not going to give them services, so not many. So to say that one costs 45,000 and the other 65 isn't a fair comparison at all. Although those numbers, I'm sure, have changed by now.
And our listeners might not be aware, and we should do a show on this very soon.
We really should. Yeah, because the for-profit prison system just does my head in.
Yeah. And we might, you know, there's a lot happening right over the border in Massachusetts around the construction of new prisons, and it's an ongoing issue here in Vermont. And people might not realize how incredibly elderly a lot of our prison population is here in Vermont. And so we have a lot of people sort of aging, hospice care, dying in prison.
And while you're at it, if you wanted to, you don't need me for this, but there are ongoing, very serious problems in staffing corrections.
Yes.
It's a big deal. I mean, their overtime costs are immense because they can't fill the slots and they can't keep people. So it's a situation that requires both long-term and short-term attention. I mean, as we said in a report, just as an aside before we go on, 5 or 6 years ago, I was interested in the cost of public safety, state and local, in Vermont. And it happened that we got all the information required, and I was shocked to learn at that time, I think this was FY17, that Vermont spent $574 million on public safety in 1 year in a state with 630,000 people.
Wow.
So it's a big deal, but it almost never gets any conversation. I was hopeful that the report would be a catalyst for those who really care about that stuff. And I know there are lots who do. One of your colleagues, Emily, who's retiring, Maxine Grad, and Dick Sears, but they end up spending most of their time putting out fires.
Yes.
Mostly what the legislature does. Not entirely, but largely.
And it's another one of those places that we have a regular theme of on this show that we know we're spending much too much money on, and that there are sort of more efficient, proactive ways of spending that money. And you need to spend in both buckets at once for a little while in order to reduce costs on the downstream side. And we don't have a lot of mechanisms in state government for doing that. We really are always making the culture, at least in the legislature and of budgeting, is these either or choices, not upstream and downstream simultaneously. And I know that Maxine, who's retiring and will be greatly missed, did a lot of work towards this justice reinvestment work, which was that when you save money, you know, downstream, you move it upstream. But I think that is really more of a philosophical moving than an actual, like, you know, fiscal waterfall effect with a specific fund dedicated to it.
Well, in order to do what you just described, which I agree with, you need different leadership on the 5th floor.
Yes.
Yes. We have just under 5 minutes before the end of this first segment. So I just want to check with you, Doug, any other reports you're working on now, or anything you want to let listeners know before we head to?
Sure, one more that was on the list, and that is broadband. And I've been interested, obviously, for a long time. I'm no expert on IT, but with the infusion of so much money, there was no question that we would go there. The question was when. What was the appropriate time? And I certainly don't want to wait 3 years after $500 million has been spent. On the other hand, we're not a rapid response team. You know, we need to spend a little time getting this work done. So we decided now is a reasonable time because the board that the legislature established for this purpose to help the CUD, the so-called CUDs in their efforts, is now putting money out on the street. And the CUDs are trying slowly, in some cases, putting out contracts to get work done. Not yet construction for the most part, but a lot of planning and some engineering and so forth. And it isn't so much about compliance with statute. It's at a higher level about, okay, is the board doing its job as required by the legislature?
Mhm.
In some ways, it's not dissimilar, excuse me. It's not dissimilar to the Green Mountain Care Board, which in my opinion was given very clear direction by the legislature 10, 12 years ago. And frankly, has not met the obligations that are so clear in statute, in my view. And in fact, when we did the first report on healthcare price transparency, somebody really wants to talk to me.
And they're like, why does he keep hanging up?
The chair of the board at that time said, yeah, they told us to do that, but they didn't tell us when. I thought that was the most arrogant thing I had heard in a really long time. Anyway, so
on the communication union districts,
Yeah.
one, Olga, we should do a show where we do a little update on
As
that.
someone who's moving to an even more
Yes.
rural town and
Yes.
her choice has gone from one internet provider to like none.
none.
Yes, I would love to talk about that.
And I actually, I know our communication union district down our way actually just hired their first full-time staff director, who is
Good.
really trying to help the organization move from what needed to be a scrappy do-it-yourself board to a governing
Yes.
board. And they're planning to have some homes wired by like next year.
Good.
Mhm.
So they're really laying down the fiber and moving forward. And I have a lot of, it's an extraordinary idea that we had, and I'm really excited about it. I have constituents who, from a regulatory perspective, I have constituents who write to me all the time and saying, can't you do anything about these companies? And I say, no, I am absolutely federally prohibited from messing with any of these telecom providers. And so instead, we created a whole new governance structure so we can hold some folks accountable who are doing this work. And it's an exciting model to me for what can be possible in Vermont, both from a governance perspective and an infrastructure perspective.
That's a very good point, because some of the contracts we've begun to look at, some include explicit performance evaluative components and others do not.
Oh, interesting.
And obviously it's about accountability and transparency ultimately. And the CUDs, the districts themselves, as you say, started largely with volunteers, not all of them, but some of them. And they could have benefited, I think, with some more front end legal assistance. Because once the contracts are signed, it's signed. So
yeah, and I don't know if you're aware that Matt Dunn's organization, Corey, has done a tremendous amount of technical assistance and legal assistance to the majority of the communication union districts as they were creating their first round of contracts. I thought that was sort of a amazing world meeting moment in Vermont politics there. Olga, let's do a whole show on that soon.
Yes, I have made a note.
Okay.
On that note, in fact, we need to hear from some of our underwriters here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. So don't touch that dial. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. You can also find us wherever you find your podcasts, as well as our Captivate page, which is the Montpelier Happy Hour.captivate.fm, our Facebook page, as well as BCTV and many PEG stations around Vermont. Hey, Emily.
Yes, Olga.
What do we need to remind listeners of?
Well, speaking of the regulation of telecom providers, the views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the host and the guests, and not the station nor the platform that you are hearing them on.
Thank you very much. And if you are just joining us, Emily and I are speaking with State Auditor and candidate for the Office of State Auditor, Doug Hoffer. So thank you so much, Doug, for joining us today.
My pleasure.
I know we want to talk about, once we have the findings, or your office has published its findings, how we actually implement those or make sure that people are being held accountable. But before we do that, I'd love to take a few minutes talking about an investigation that I believe you published this summer Looking at, and just because I think it will dovetail into the next conversation, looking at money spent on reducing homelessness in Vermont. And just as a disclaimer, my day job is working for an engineering, architect, and development firm where, of course, we focus on housing a lot, and at times receive state money for that housing. So there's my disclaimer. So Doug, I didn't get a chance to read the investigation word for word, but one thing I found very interesting in your conclusion, particularly, is you looked at the amount of spending that's been put out since, I believe, 2017. And one of the things you said is we don't have a measure for success, and we don't have a plan for a lot of this spending. Could you dive into that for us?
Well, sure. It's not as if, state employees and bureaucrats don't have any idea what they're doing. They all have an idea about how to move forward. And there are existing programs, some that were developed or expanded because of the pandemic, in particular the motel deal, when people were encouraged or required to be separated so that, congregate facilities like COTS in Burlington, I'm sure you have something similar in Brattleboro, where you might have a number of people in one facility, that was discouraged because of COVID. So what do we do with people? Well, they put them in motels, and that cost a great deal of money. We weren't the only state that did that, but we did it with gusto. In any case, I'm not sure there's evidence that we're spending nearly as much money addressing the causes of homelessness, recognizing that there are some problems that can't be solved in a traditional sense, but a significant percentage of people who find themselves homeless at one point or another have needs that can be met, whether they're, abused spouses who have to get out of the house with or without kids, all kinds of things, mental health issues for sure. And money is spent on those things, but the focus has been on housing, which is understandable because we obviously need a lot more housing of many types, but certainly affordable housing, and certainly at the low end. But you have to do it all.
I just want to make sure that when we talk about sort of reasons that people become homeless that are fairly quickly resolvable, we also include the fact that we have a huge number of people in Vermont right now that are being evicted from their homes and just can't find another place to go.
Yeah.
Yep. So, the amount of money spent was significant, and obviously, expanded because of the flow of federal funds. And I'm grateful. We're all grateful for the extra money at the time, but that's going to dry up a little bit. It already has begun to, and we need a good plan going forward. And there doesn't appear to be evidence that the number of homeless people is actually declining. That's what I meant by there's no evidence of winning the war. And I'm not even sure we have a measure, as we said in the report. Some of the measures appear to be more about housing, which is great. I would never say spend a penny less on housing, spend twice as much, but we have to do all the other stuff as well.
Maybe a decade ago, I had the opportunity to work with Angus Cheney when he was the director of housing at the Agency of Human Services. And I remember when I met him, he was just very clear, like, my job is to end homelessness in Vermont. And he really believed and had a clear plan to do that within 5 years. And felt like it was very achievable, because honestly, we're not talking about all that many people. And we have the majority of folks who are in motels right now or in various other situations where they don't have long-term housing have or are connected to opportunities for vouchers to pay for their housing long-term. So the transition into housing is not a financial one. We know that it's so much more expensive to support someone once they already become homeless than to keep them in their housing. We know that, court systems related to evictions are incredibly expensive for everyone, including the owner of the housing unit that's evicting. Like, we know that all these things are so inefficient. I don't know, Doug, if you got into what seems to me to be like tremendous price gouging on the part of some of the motel owners through the motel process, like really just remarkably high prices being paid by the state to pretty horrifically mediocre hotel rooms. And so, like,
interestingly, at a time when, because of COVID, tourism was way down. So the motels probably wouldn't have had much, business notwithstanding the state's contribution. So no,
Right,
I agree. You're
right.
right. We didn't document that, but I think you're right.
I really do actually think the AG's office should look into that particular instance of price gouging, because I've been,
Well, but we agreed to it.
yeah,
It makes
I
the
know,
state
we did.
complicit,
It does. It totally does. So we have all of this inefficient money, and we know that we need to, it's another one of those upstream, downstream things. So what would a plan, we have not had a plan since Angus Chaney left quite a long time ago. There isn't a director of housing anywhere in the state right now. There's the Agency of Commerce.
The players include VHFA for sure.
Yes.
Laura Collins is devoted to this part of her job for sure. The folks at within ACDC, the Agency of Commerce, the Housing and Community Development folks, there is a housing component. They are engaged. The state
and
housing authority.
Josh Hanford is absolutely the director of housing in the context of commerce.
Right. So there's a lot of people in the game, and as far as I know, all of them are devoted to doing what they think is best or what's required of them, which is not always the same thing. But Governor Shumlin, for his part, issued an executive order a number of years ago that said any housing development henceforth that included state or federal money is going to include at least 15% units that will be available to folks in or likely to be in or just coming out of homelessness. And that sounds great. But what it does effectively is say, we're going to spread resources all over the state, and it's not targeted geographically. Normally I'm not interrupted that often. I should just turn the volume off. I'm sorry, but it's a good idea. It was done with good intentions, but I'm not sure it's making that much of a difference, particularly because in many areas of the state where there are certainly some homeless people, the numbers are modest, but the 15% remains. And what happens is the developer or the owner is required to first make it available to homeless folks. And if they can't find them, then to go down the line to low income folks and so forth. And that's fine. But then it's not available to homeless people. And the money devoted to it is not available for anything else. So there's a lot of questions and not a lot of answers as yet.
And so when you were talking to the folks for this investigation who are involved in housing issues and reducing homelessness, did they give you, because what I'm hearing is that while we have a lot of people involved, we have a lot of resources dedicated to the issue, rightly so, we may not actually have a unified plan for the state and a unified vision or definitions of what success would look like. For example, yes, we're really good at getting people into temporary housing, but we're struggling getting them into long-term housing. So long-term housing is the definition of success. That just as an example. But did you get a sense from folks where we should start pointing some of our planning or what that vision could look like?
Well, not surprisingly, the folks at DCF believe there is a plan, and they're moving forward with the components of it that are within their purview. Nobody is willing to stand up and say, no, we don't have a plan, because most of the people involved work for the state, and the state believes it has a plan, and it does. My question is, how well is it going? Is it working? Do you have data to suggest? And what they would say is, well, the trends are thus and thus. Well, the trends aren't always good. We have more people currently who are identified as homeless than we did 2 or 3 years ago. And as Emily said earlier, and you were absolutely right, there really aren't that many people at any given time who are homeless. So to spend hundreds of millions of dollars and have more homeless people than we did before begs the question of why are so many people characterized as or literally experiencing homelessness? And it's funny, in the conversations, you almost never hear anybody talk about jobs and wages. And we, as you know well, and as Emily pointed out, housing is expensive, really expensive in Vermont, and beyond the means of many, many people, many of whom are working. So that's another piece that doesn't get much airtime.
Well, again, I
Aging.
love to talk about how affordability is not necessarily about cutting the cost of things. Sometimes it's
Mhm.
about making sure that people actually make enough money to pay for all of those things. And we have really remarkably stagnant wages here in Vermont, despite
So
a
That's funny,
workforce
a few years
shortage.
ago, there was a movement for $15 an hour. And now we have $15 an hour because the market demanded it.
Mhm.
But, it seems like 20 minutes ago, they said the economy would collapse if we went to $15 an hour.
Right.
Yeah. And, even though I think there's been movement between sort of the 15 to 20 range, I have not seen very much movement in any of the other wages in Vermont.
Mhm.
So your sort of entry level salaried position is still like at $45,000 a year and hasn't moved for the 20 years I've
Right.
been working
Correct.
in the nonprofit sector.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Going back to conversations I've had with my colleagues at the engineering architecture and development firm, a problem they run into a lot is when it comes to at least their small piece of the housing landscape, it is often more expensive to create the housing or to rehabilitate something and like an old mill building and put it back into housing than it is the rents you can get for it is kind of the stumbling block they often fall into.
And
Well,
I think that's
nothing new.
particularly true if you're trying to make profits off of it.
Right.
Yeah, that's nothing new. That's why.
Well, they're not a nonprofit
Yeah,
organization.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The biggest developers are the nonprofit developers,
Mhm.
and that's why VHCB directs most of the money that they receive for housing to nonprofit developers.
Mhm.
And furthermore, the for-profit developers aren't interested at the low end. They want to maximize profit. That's their business. So they go to the high end.
So this leaves me back at the question,
Mhm.
Doug, of your office has identified a clear challenge. It's a challenge that, I think people involved were aware of before you named it. And then you named it quite explicitly on paper and, proclaimed to the world, as is your job and your office's job. And then what? So,
How do we actually make change?
yeah. And so the legislature can certainly mandate that a plan is created. And we sort of know how well that went with the climate action plan. We can set clear targets about what solving the problem looks like. When neither of those things happen well, because we have an administration that seems, despite incredibly skilled people working in it, an administration that seems really bent on dissolving the value of government. I don't know what comes after that.
Well, as you said, and as you know well, there's no shortage of strategic plans for virtually any major issue we can think of. And there are some of those for homelessness as well. I'm of the view that you can't solve a problem until you accurately define it. And I'm not entirely sure that this problem has been accurately defined by the administration or even by the legislature for that matter. There are so many moving parts. And as I said, a significant amount or percent of the resources are devoted to one admittedly key element, which is housing. And that is supported by all the housing people who love building housing. And we love them to build housing. But if the number of homeless people isn't going down, even as we're building more housing, then we should rethink this somehow. I'm no expert in homelessness or related subjects, but I don't see a commitment to that. But that's not their job. Although you, Emily, well, you can learn a lot from those folks because they're the ones who deal directly with some portion of the population that we're talking about. I don't, you don't, you may have in the past, but not so much now. But I think everybody needs to be at the table, but you really need leadership. You need a governor and leaders in the legislature on the same page. There are some things that can be resolved with much less effort. In my view, if you say, my goodness, we should spend more money on childcare. Well, I agree. Then you only have to find the money. And you can have some good conversations about that. But this is a much more complex situation. Once you get into mental health, you're in a quagmire. it's so complicated, but it's about whether people have the right to expect us to help them get through. And I think we all agree that we do, but we haven't done too well. I mean, you can go back 25 years to the closure of the Brandon facility, when it was understandably believed that, well, we need to get people back into the community and out of these institutions. And there's certainly some truth to that for some people. But Brandon, and I'm not cheering Brandon, but the idea of a place like that as a place where some folks who aren't best suited to be in the community can live and get services.
I mean, I think there's a huge spectrum between fully institutionalizing folks. And, Olga and I both live in a community that has hosted a mental hospital for 150 years, I think.
Right.
More. Yeah.
And so feel very aware of sort of the impacts of people living there and leaving there and not having services when they leave there and all of those things. But there's a huge spectrum between being fully institutionalized and being hypothetically connected to a community mental health provider who is not actually particularly connected to you because they are not working in the community. And there's a lot we can do in that spectrum, and housing and the intersection between housing and services and different models of housing beyond just, studio apartments and 2-bedroom apartment. Like, there's so much that can be done in housing and in building community within that housing in the context of supportive services, whether that's for substance use or mental health or co-occurring disorders or child welfare. So much that can be done there that, like you said, does not seem to be an integrated part of any plan that's being put forward to end homelessness. Because it's a complex problem. I think childcare might be a slightly more complex problem than you're giving it credit for, Doug. But on the context of housing, it's, we do need to build more housing, but we need to build more types of housing than we're building. We need to be thinking about the services in that housing. We need to be thinking about what it takes for people to retain their housing. We need to think about the fact that we have the most underutilized housing stock in the entire country at this point, in terms of the number of bedrooms that people have that aren't being used in their houses, the square footage and the acreage that people have as individuals, and just the number of second homes that sit vacant most of the year. And
the growth of Airbnb type short-term rentals has been very significant in taking units off the market.
It has, but actually the more I talk to Maura Collins about this, because I don't know if you're aware, but I sponsored a bill to basically ban short-term rentals, and was the subject of much energy on behalf of the short-term rental market. And agree, but realize, talking more and more with Maura about the scale of our second homes, it's really only a small fraction of those vacant homes that are subsidized by short-term rentals. And so what happens is that we have basically the less wealthy second homeowners are doing short-term rentals, but the wealthier second homeowners don't bother with short-term rentals. And so it's certainly expanded the number of people who might be able to access a second home. And own a second home.
Yeah, there's no doubt that places like Stowe and so forth have a lot of those, but we see a lot of that here in Burlington too.
Yes,
and these are not vacation homes.
No,
they're just homes where people maybe are moving, took a job somewhere else, and instead of selling, they're saying, hey, we can make a lot of money doing this other thing and not sell the house.
And we have that in Brattleboro, and we also actually in Brattleboro and the surrounding areas have a lot of historic second homes that are left vacant all the time.
Right. Just doing a time check. We have a little more than 5 minutes before the end of the show. And I just want to make sure that we've really dug into that question of how do we make change once we have defined the problem.
Okay, here's a really great example that I think Doug loves too. We've worked together a lot on. So the Vermont Employment Growth Program, VEGI, has been audited and discovered by the auditor's office numerous times to be not meeting its statutory requirements and not fulfilling its programmatic promises. We've had numerous, and then those findings have been picked up by the media numerous times. Henry Epp in particular is like really on the case on that one. And I have introduced legislation numerous times on it, have had conversations in various committees about accountability for that. And yet, I've even talked to sort of organizations that are associated with those programs who are starting to see the need for more accountability in those programs. And yet still, nothing changes. And this is sort of a risky thing for me to say, to my constituents, to the world, because I sound pretty ineffective, but I think by most measures, I'm a fairly effective legislator, all things considered. But this little nugget, which is a fairly tiny little corner of state government that most people don't pay attention to or care about, I think is a great example of how do you solve these just very clear screaming problems in the context of a legislature that really doesn't have time for accountability, only has time for sort of new programs and new problems.
Well, thank you for bringing that up. In my experience, this issue is certainly not unique, but represents a real problem because for change, for the simple reason that when it comes up, if there's actually time devoted in committee, which is rare enough, it's very simple for the advocates at the Agency of Commerce and the RDCs and so forth in the chamber to get on the phone and call companies that have been beneficiaries of this program. And they're from all over the state. So almost every legislator in the room is going to have somebody come in that they know in the room. That's so different than just having a core group dispersed around the state. Is, well, I like that program. That's nice. But when they show up in your committee room, I'm not picking on you, but you know what I'm saying.
Oh, yeah.
Legislators are understandably sensitive to seeing prominent business people come in and say, that program was the best thing that ever happened to my company. Well, my point is, in the work we've done, there's no evidence to support that. It may be true, but I can't audit faith. So if there's no evidence, then why do we keep spending the money? But to your question, why doesn't it work, Olga? Part of the reason is just pure politics and power. If poor people feel like they need to have a program amended, revised, strengthened, whatever, they can come into the legislature, and there are lots of people who are sympathetic and empathetic. Right. That's not the same as having prominent business people come in and say, boy, I can't even begin to think about what's going to happen if you change this program or get rid of it. That's the dynamics of the power involved.
And I think that is something we bump up against with change in general, is when someone is benefiting from something, a system, a program, a pot of money, whatever, how do you convince them that letting go of that benefit is going to have other benefits?
Right. Well, to me, the way Emily and her colleagues should respond when confronted with that is, we have a better idea how to spend that very same amount of money. We don't want to get rid of the support. We want to refocus it somewhere else or some other way.
And I think what I see sometimes when I make suggestions such as that is that people don't trust state government enough to follow through on the other end of that, or don't trust politicians enough to follow through on the other end of that. So the threat of letting go of something what that is, in order for the promise of what could be, is very, very hard to step into, given that you've not had a strong track record in your own lifetime of seeing government fulfill whatever promises it makes. And part of it, that's just we do a terrible job of actually letting people know when we do fulfill promises, right? So we passed some really great laws this last year. We allocated funding for some really great programs. But some of that happened a year ago. It's barely being rolled out now. It's not being rolled out the way it was designed. And so when exactly do you scream it from the ramparts?
Well, shortly after I took this job, I was at the golf course on some Saturday or Sunday, and there's a guy I hadn't seen in a while, and he had clearly read a report in the media about a report we just released. And he said, "Hey, Hoffer, why don't you just tell us what works?" And I got a laugh out of it. It was funny. But as I said at the outset before we came on the air, I don't want to be known as the guy who only talks about what doesn't work. But that's often what we report. Having said that, there's a lot of good stuff that's happening, but you guys aren't paying me to report about that.
Right.
As a rule.
We have just a couple minutes left, Doug, and this is the other question I'm asking all the candidates who are coming on board on the show, is if you could enact one policy, and it could be any policy, that you feel would make Vermont work better for everybody, what would that be?
I won't talk about a policy. I'll talk about resources.
Okay.
This conversation that we've just been having is about the legislature, which is critical. Governors come and go, but the legislature as an institution really needs help, in my opinion. They need a lot more resources. In some ways, with no disrespect to any of the people who've occupied the two top positions as Speaker and Pro Tem, they need to work better together. They need for the committees of jurisdiction to work together. If they started out at the beginning of the year and say your committee met with finance or the top people in each committee, what are we going to do this year? Find the areas of common interest and do that. But most importantly, resources. The only committees that get regular help from the Joint Fiscal Office are the money committees, appropriately so. But what about all the other committees that deal with large appropriations and important issues? They need the same kind of fiscal analysis that the money committees do, and it's not there. And I haven't seen the legislature ask itself, are we ready to tell the people of Vermont we need a little more money? Why not? You're part-timers. Some of you have more experience than others. You have lives. You need more help, in my opinion. And if the legislature had a lot more help, I think we would be much better off for it.
Well, State Auditor and candidate for State Auditor, Doug Hoffer, thank you so much for joining us today. If people want to learn more about you or your office, where can they go for information?
You can go to the state website, auditor.gov.
Fantastic. Emily, if people want to know more about you?
Folks can go to emilykornheiser.org and you'll find links to social media, phone numbers, emails, blog posts, all the fun things. And I would like to say, I am going to vote for Doug because I am very excited about the legislature getting more resources. And I'm actually working on a project to try to see if we can get an internal accountability office within the legislative staff team.
Exciting. Well, as always, the Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, will return Friday at 2 o'clock. And in the meantime, you can find us wherever you find your podcasts, as well as drop us a line at the Montpelier Happy Hour at gmail.com at any time. Thanks so much, folks.
Thank you both.